Resuming debate.
Member for Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to participate today on the C-46 as I did the other day on C-8, dealing with another free trade agreement that the government is looking at, and this one dealing with Panama. Obviously, free trade agreements are important to Canada, particularly given that we export over 80% of our goods, and obviously Canada needs to be competitive in the international community. It's obviously disturbing, Mr. Speaker, that first time in over 30 years we have a significant trade deficit, and obviously that is something that the government needs to really look at a comprehensive approach in terms of how we are going to deal on the international community with the issue of trade. Now, at the moment, we have these agreements which are really, I would consider one-off, the one with Jordan, and now this one with Panama. We had last session talked about Colombia. The difficulty, Mr. Speaker, is that our competitors are taking a much more aggressive approach. For example, we have no free trade agreements with any state in Asia, and obviously with markets such as Japan, China, India, the ASEAN members. This is very, very important. So a multilateral approach, particularly with ASEAN, would be beneficial. The fact that we're still in negotiations with Korea for I think we're in the 7th round now, Singapore the 9th round. This is disturbing given the fact that the Americans have been reaching out. We see the Japanese concluding free trade agreements with countries as diverse as the Philippines and Mexico. And yet at the same time, we are doing these small agreements. Now, obviously, the one with Panama is it's fine. We on this side of the House certainly support it going to committee. But again, in terms of the big picture, in terms of the real issues that we need to be grappling with on the issue of free trade, particularly with the fact that multilateral approaches really give us a bigger market. For example, with ASEAN, 590 million people. From Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, etc. Very, very important. And yet we are simply chipping away. We are not really have a coherent policy in terms of how we should tackle trade issues. Obviously, a significant 75%, 80% of the trade with the United States means that when there's an economic downturn, as we've seen, that has had an impact on our economy. And so we need to diversify. But diversifying with Jordan and Panama is not going to solve the bigger picture. It's not going to also deal with what our competitors have been doing internationally, where we need to be in the game. We have simply been much more, in my view, Mr. Speaker, on the sidelines. We have to engage on these major markets. We have opportunities out there, but again, government needs to lead. Government needs to demonstrate. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce a few years ago wrote a very compelling paper about China, and they clearly indicated that there was no policy of this government in terms of how to engage that market. How do we make sure that Canadian business, whether it's in the area of environmental technology, which Canada is a world leader on, particularly the area of clean air, clean water, contaminated sites, this is a work that is very, very important and certainly useful for China, and yet, again, we need to be part of that, and again, we're not seeing the kind of leadership that we need in order to go forward. From that standpoint, again, these agreements that the government has been putting forward simply focus on a very small niche. It is not dealing with the kind of issues that we believe should be done. We're seeing in the United States increasing protectionism. That obviously is concerned, particularly in the agricultural area. That means obviously difficulties for our farmers. It's a difficulty in terms of us being able to compete in the international arena, and obviously the United States protectionist policies are having an effect here. We've even seen obviously on the America First policy, which really, even though the government in their discussion with the United States, there were changes made in terms of Canadian companies being able to compete, that only affected 37 states out of the U.S. 50. So that obviously is important, that we be there. And so the Conservative government has not taken the kind of leadership that we think is needed in terms of both on the multilateral side, in terms of being much more visible with the United States, and policy in the United States is simply not done in Washington. It's done obviously in districts and in states across the U.S. That's where we need to be focusing our efforts on. We need to indicate, but particularly Canadian business can compete with anyone in the world if there's a level playing field. When there's not a level playing field, obviously we have the difficulties that we often face. So although our party supports going to committee, the fact is that we'd like to see a clear strategy, particularly on the emerging key markets, whether that's Brazil or whether that's India or China or whether Japan. We have continually watched others, and we've seen the United States, Australia, and others been very aggressive, in particular in the Asia-Pacific, talking about a big Asia-Pacific free trade zone. These are the kind of things which mean that if they're in first, we obviously pick up the pieces. And I think Canadian business deserve more than picking up the pieces. They deserve the opportunity to do that. But again, you have to be aggressive. You can talk free trade, but you have to really demonstrate it. The only way to demonstrate that is to show that kind of leadership. The current situation, if I might say, and Mr. Speaker is certainly aware of that with Korea, is that the issue of penetrating that market, particularly in the automotive sector. And the Japanese are watching very carefully our discussions with Korea, because in fact, if, and it's a big if, a free trade agreement were to occur between Canada and Korea, the Japanese would be particularly anxious then to come to the table. At the moment, of course, the Americans are talking to them about possible free trade. And some people say, well, you know, you can never get a free trade agreement with Japan because of agriculture. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know too many people in this House who represent ridings that have a lot of rice, because rice is always the one issue the Japanese deal with. And even then, Japan was able to conclude a successful agreement with the Philippines as an example. The issue of this particular agreement, and again, we are supportive of sending it to committee, is obviously that Canadian merchandise, we export to Panama things like machinery, electronic equipment, pharmaceutical equipment, etc. But again, a relatively small market. But it is, of course, important that we also look at some of the other free trading zones or trade zones in Latin America. And of course, Latin America has developed, along with states like Argentina, Uruguay, etc., Chile, zones in which the free flow of goods is evident, the dropping of tariffs, in order, again, for business to compete. We need to send out a very clear message as a country that we are prepared to enter into agreements where, of course, it's in our national interest. Obviously, we have to look at environmental issues, and again, one of the things that this country has traditionally been a leader on has been in the area dealing with climate change issues, dealing with the issues, as I said before, in clean water and clean air, where countries really need that expertise. And Canadians not only are very cost effective in terms of what they're able to produce and export, but they do it in such a way, and of course, for many countries we can do it, of course, in 2 official languages, which is, of course, very, very helpful. But again, if we're not at the table, then that's a problem. We also have to look at the issues of labor cooperation. I notice in this agreement, again, there's a side agreements on labor cooperation, and obviously we have to expect that what we are asking is what we would demand at home, and obviously the right to association, the right to collective bargaining, of course, the abolition of child labor, which again, these are standards which we would expect the same in dealing with other countries, and those are side arrangements. So the advantage, and I know some colleagues have some concerns, particularly on the labor end of it, is that when it goes to committee, we have the appropriate witnesses come, we can have those kind of discussions, and obviously strengthen where need be provisions where people have those concerns. So I think that is important. No piece of legislation that I've seen in 14 years here is ever perfect, and that's why we send them to the committee. That's why colleagues have the opportunity to look very carefully at legislation, and then have the opportunity, in terms of what they hear from the witnesses, to move forward. My understanding is, and in terms of the major stakeholders on this particular bill with Panama, there is no major objections. On the whole, it's again a fairly straightforward agreement. Again, it will give us some access, but again, we have to build on that, particularly in the Central American region with countries like Nicaragua, Guatemala, Costa Rica, those kind of countries, obviously also looking at better cooperation, and again, as a balanced off with the United States, Canada could play certainly I think an important role. Again, it's a whole issue of a level playing field for access for markets, which of course we need to do. We need to be able to at least secure that, and so that when we're looking at new partnerships or we're looking at new customers, that we are able as a country to say to our business community, here is an opportunity, you go forth. And of course, there were reservations about, even with the free trade agreement with the United States, as to whether or not we could compete. Well, obviously we can compete extremely well when there is that field available. Mr. Speaker, this particular piece of legislation, 12.6% of Canada's total exports go out. In this particular country, we've got about 17.3 imports coming in. Again, this Canadian economy is so dependent on trade, over 80%. In order to do that, we have to be able to have as much access to markets as we can, because obviously, and former Prime Minister Trudeau in the 70s talked about the third option, and that third option was to diversify. That's right. And if we'd done that diversification in the 70s and 80s, maybe we would be maybe in better shape than we are, because again, as a trading nation, the worst thing that can happen is tariffs. Obviously, I'm not old enough, but there are those, although some of my colleagues might say that in the 1930s, I know some on the other side, in the 1930s when we had the Great Depression, the first thing that happened, of course, is that major tariff barriers went up, and of course protectionism became rampant. And that obviously is not something we want to do. Well, I might say, Mr. Speaker, sometimes I do feel old enough. If you're in here long enough, sometimes you hear the debates, but I think the